Paul Johnson. A three-part question. What would have happened last year?
Three-part question is cheating. It's like
I'll just make it one sentence. Last year when we had a collapse, what if the government had done nothing? Did the government need to be involved? Secondly, Mr. Berenbaum, you indicated that we're not through this. Do you expect another collapse of the magnitude we experienced 14 months ago? And in 40 words or less, could you just state what governmental actions actually contributed to the collapse a year ago? Thank you.
I'll start with 2 and 3. I don't think I'm qualified to address the first. I don't believe we're through this by anywhere near the mark. I'm hopeful, the recent administration announcements on the home affordable mortgage program, 600,000 of these modifications are in process, is hopeful, but anyone in the industry knows there's a lot of fallout from those numbers. Also, there's been a lot of reluctance by private investors and servicers to buy into the government program. There's a waterfall of private sector products, ironically, that still have things like interest-only loan products to help consumers through on the short term, which are not sustainable for the long term. The fact of the matter is that we have upwards of 10 million at-risk consumers. So programs that reach 1 million, 2 million on a case-by-case basis are not going to help property values, are not going to help consumers, are not going to help the investors. And that's why we're interested in bulk solutions. I quickly touched earlier on a proposal that we spoke of over a year and a half ago, which we called To Help Now. The idea was to use the market to, in fact, help self-correct. Wall Street for years has had a vehicle, we've actually spoken to Wall Street Without Walls, where there is a reverse auction process to sell off parts of portfolios on the marketplace. If, in fact, interested parties would begin to sell these portfolios in a reverse auction process to Treasury or another government agency, a home loan corporation similar to that was done during the Depression, whatever it may be, those loans could then be scrubbed to become 30-year fixed rate. The savings, because there would be a substantial savings right now based on the property values, the value of the tranches, would then be used to modify the loans down to an affordable rate for the consumers. And then guess what we would do with the conventional 30-year fixed rates? The government would not hold them. They would sell them back to the investment community. So virtually no cost to the government. Rather than buying bad loans, rather than investing in the banks. This is what's holding the banks and everyone back right now. They're still holding the paper. So that's one practical solution that Treasury and others are beginning to look at. As far as the forecast, clearly there are a lot of motivated parties right now. The problem, though, is the current system is not working to facilitate solutions like Help Now or others. And I'll close with just a passing thought. I mean, if we're talking about what if we let the banks fail, well, what if we let homeowners use judicial modification or bankruptcy protection? Credit Suisse and others argue that we would save about 1/3 of the properties right now that are facing foreclosure. And it's not easy, as you all know, as counsel, to qualify for bankruptcy protection. And there were a lot of compromises in the bills that were passed. I fully expect we're going to see that come back next year as legislation again as the numbers continue to rise in foreclosure.
I perhaps want to echo the kind of stirring speech we heard last night from Judge Ginsburg. But by way of saying, we hear a lot about aligning the interests of executives and administrators who the government regulates with the shareholders. We hear a little less about the possibility of the government as a shareholder necessarily aligning itself with these other shareholders rather than potentially elevating its own interests. And realistically, since the political branches operate on kind of, if you're a congressman, your long-term interest is the election in 2 years. And so I think the only branch possibly that could provide some enforcement here would more likely be the judicial branch, and I don't mean it necessarily in a substantive way, but I mean by enforcing the procedural checks. And David, I think, referred to it in his comments about the TARP. I mean, there's no delegation run as riot as the TARP, and yet we have great problems with standing, even if it's after the fact, and has very little impact on those actual decisions and what happens with GM, is there merit here to attempting to mount legal challenges to that kind of delegation?
Well, it was attempted in the context of the bankruptcy of, I think it was of Chrysler, and the Second Circuit said the language of the definition of financial institution is essentially broad enough to mean whatever the Secretary of Treasury says it means. Essentially it means any corporation that the Secretary decides to spend TARP money on. And I don't think there was, I don't recall a delegation issue being raised in that context. But if there was, I'm sure it would have gotten the answer that is the standard one, which is there is no such thing.
And I think this is where Corker Warner could come in and maybe play some sort of a role to have an independent trust, independent trustees, who can stand up to the Treasury and stand up to Congress as well. And I think this is where the issue of sovereign immunity comes in as well, and the sovereign immunity protections in the EESA and more generally, and the fact that I think it's not some judicial review of Treasury's decisions as a shareholder could be good, but I think also one step removed from that, even in advance of that, Treasury having more incentive to go talk to the OLC and get opinions and get advice, I think could be good, because I think that dynamic in advance of litigation is good, and I think sovereign immunity, just gives you no reason to drop a line to the OLC.
And your comment about the relation of government shareholders to other shareholders is an interesting one in the context of GM and Chrysler, because of course the government decided that all the other shareholders of those companies would be completely wiped out, and that the ownership interest in those two companies would be whatever the government determined it should be. And that's exactly what occurred. If you were a common shareholder of GM or Chrysler, your shares were rendered worthless.
We have one more question.